Boris Petrov hesitated to mail the letter in his hand. His 91-year-old hands were trembling, but this time not from age, but from uncertainty. On the envelope was written to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky personal. Who would listen to an old man's words, he muttered. But then he remembered that young leader's tired but determined face on television, and he dropped the letter into the mailbox. Boris lived alone in the small Polish town of WWII. In 1943, when he was only 19 years old, he had fought at Stalingrad. He knew how to survive those terrible winter days, how to lead, how to keep hope alive. And now, every night on television, he watched a leader 20 years younger than himself fighting the same battle. "This boy is experiencing what I saw," he had told his neighbor woman. "But he's alone, and I was alone too." In his letter he had written, "Dear President Zelensky, I am Boris Petrov, 91 years old, a World War II veteran. I watch you on television every night. In 1943, I was also your age and trying to protect my people. I want to tell you something. Being afraid is normal, but surrendering never is. I want to teach you four words that saved my life. Tomorrow the sun will rise again." After mailing the letter, Boris forgot about it, until 6 days later when his door was knocked. When he opened the door, 3 men stood before him. One was a Ukrainian translator, another a security officer, and the third, Boris couldn't believe his eyes. "Mr. Petrov," the man said in Ukrainian, while the translator interpreted. "I am Volodymyr Zelensky. I came to thank you for your letter." Boris's legs trembled. This couldn't be possible. "Please, let's sit," said Zelensky, taking Boris by the arm. "I have many things to discuss with you." Boris let him in, noticing his hands were still shaking. The living room was small, the walls filled with war photographs. Zelensky carefully examined each one. "Is this you?" he asked, pointing to a photograph from 1943. "Yes," Boris said quietly, "taken after Stalingrad. I was 19 then, just like the Ukrainian children fighting now." Zelensky looked closer at the photograph. "Your eyes have the same exhaustion, the same determination too." Boris nodded. "Mr. President, I watch your speeches on television, and I noticed something. You carry the same burden." "What burden?" "The burden of everyone looking at you. The burden of everyone expecting miracles from you. I carried that burden 80 years ago." Zelensky leaned back. "And how did you endure?" Boris smiled. "With 4 words I told myself every night. Tomorrow the sun will rise again." "You wrote that in your letter too." "Because those words saved my life. In the darkest nights, in the most hopeless moments, I repeated this to myself." Zelensky leaned forward. "Would you tell me about those nights?" Boris took a deep breath. "Winter of 1943, the siege of Stalingrad. Our unit was in great difficulty. The boys were hungry, cold, dying. I was their small unit commander. One night, our youngest soldier Pavel, only 17 years old, asked me, 'Commander, will we die tomorrow?' His voice began to tremble. I looked at him and said, 'Pavel, tomorrow the sun will rise again, and we will be here.' That night, the cold was deadly, but in the morning the sun really did rise, and Pavel was alive." Zelensky listened silently. "From that day on, every difficult night, we would repeat together with my unit, 'Tomorrow the sun will rise again.' This wasn't just words, it had become faith." "What happened to Pavel?" Boris's eyes filled. "He finished the war, returned home, started a family, lived to 89. He died 2 years ago. But before he died, the last letter he wrote to me said, 'Commander, tomorrow the sun will rise again, and you still remember us.'" Tears flowed from Zelensky's eyes. "Mr. President," Boris said, "I hear what you tell your people. I see how you speak on television." "You hear the question?" Pavel asked me every day thousands of times. "Will we die tomorrow?" And you must tell them the same thing. "But what if I'm wrong?" Boris put his hand on Zelensky's shoulder. "Do you think the sun won't rise?" Zelensky laughed through his tears. "That's it. Boris said. The sun always rises. Our job is to endure until then. They talked for 3 hours that day. Boris told stories from Stalingrad. Zelensky shared experiences from Kiev. 2 different wars, 2 different generations, but the same spirit. When Zelensky was leaving, he hugged Boris. "Boris," he said, "this conversation changed me. Now every difficult night I will repeat your words." "Don't forget," Boris said. "You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for future generations, just like we did." As Zelensky got in his car, he looked at Boris one last time. The old man stood at the door, waving. That night when Zelensky addressed his people, he ended his speech like this: "Tonight I want to tell you 4 words I learned from a friend. These words were spoken at Stalingrad 80 years ago and saved lives. Tomorrow the sun will rise again." The video went viral worldwide. Boris's story reached millions of people, but the real impact was seen in Ukraine. "Tomorrow the sun will rise again" became a slogan. Soldiers wrote it on walls. Mothers said it to their children. Elders repeated it to the young. When Boris saw his impact on television, he was surprised. "I just told the truth," he told his neighbor. "The sun really does rise every day." A month later, Boris received an unexpected package. Inside was a Ukrainian flag and a note from Zelensky. "Boris, this flag was flying in the safest place in Kiev. Now I want it to fly at your home, because security is found not just in place, but in spirit. Tomorrow the sun will rise again. VZ." Boris hung the flag in his window. Every morning when the sun rose, he looked at it. 6 months later, Zelensky came again. This time he wasn't alone. With him was a group of young Ukrainian soldiers. "Boris," Zelensky said, "these young men want to learn your story. Would you tell them those 4 words?" Boris looked at the young men. In each of their eyes was the same fear, the same hope, the same determination, just like in Pavel's eyes 80 years ago. "My sons," he said slowly, "war is a terrible thing, but don't let fear defeat you. Every difficult night, tell yourselves this: tomorrow the sun will rise again, and we will be here." One of the young men, Maxim, who was Pavel's age, asked, "But what if the sun rises but our friends are no longer with us?" Boris's eyes filled. Pavel had asked the same question. "Then," he said, "you greet the sun for them too. You live for them too. And you tell their stories." That day, a small monument was built in Boris's small house garden. Written on it in Russian, Ukrainian and Polish was, "Tomorrow the sun will rise again. Hope for all warriors." Zelensky spoke at the monument's opening. "Boris taught us that hope is not just a word, but action. Waking up each day is action. Choosing to live each day is action. And believing in the future each day is the greatest action." A year passed. Boris turned 92, but had never felt this alive. Every week letters came from around the world. Young soldiers, old veterans, mothers affected by war, all saying the same thing. The words, "Tomorrow the sun will rise again," strengthened them. One day Zelensky called for the last time. "Boris," he said, "I have good news for you. The war is ending." Boris cried silently. "Well, will the sun rise?" Zelensky asked in a playful voice. Boris laughed. "It always does, my child. It always does." That evening Boris sat across from Pavel's photograph. "Pavel," he whispered, "I kept my promise. I made sure they saw the sun too." And in the small town of Wieliczka, the sun set once more. But Boris knew that tomorrow it would rise again, because sometimes an old man's letter can change the hope of the entire world, and sometimes the simplest truths carry the deepest wisdom. Tomorrow the sun will rise again. Final message. Boris Petrov's story reminds us that the wisdom brought by age, hope tested by time, and shared experience are more powerful than any technology. A 91-year-old man's letter gave hope to millions of people, because true leadership doesn't live in age, but in spirit. If this story gave you hope, share it, because sometimes the smallest gestures start the biggest changes. And as Boris said, tomorrow the sun will rise again.